Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Randy Bach. Today is 2/2/2/2/2/2/2, February 2nd, 2022. So there's a zero in there someplace. But if you just do the other numbers the way you write, it's 2/2/2/2. Um, so I'm happy to see you too here. Um, what's new in the world of COVID? Well, what's new in the world? It seems that COVID is the big narrative. It shouldn't be. It's COVID-19. And right now, as I mentioned above, we are COVID 22. Most people who are getting COVID now are getting actually COVID 21. I think this distinction should be made because the vaccine is COVID 19. Now, I don't want to do too much math here, but that's 3 years ago, pretty much. And if COVID-19 was eking out in June of 2019, it's had plenty of time to mutate, and it does. And it doesn't really think about it, doesn't want to. It's just the way things work when you are making hundreds of billions of replications across hundreds of millions of people. Mistakes are made when anything gets replicated or duplicated. It's never perfect. Whether it's your copy machine. Even identical twins, they're not precisely the same. And the same happens with virions when they are making themselves. They make a blueprint to make themselves. They never come out. Not every single one comes. Most of the mutations, though, are going to be meaningless, and they're not going to be thriving. The ones that can thrive and do thrive without an animal reservoir in which to kind of jump and hide. If you're going to become a human to human virus exclusively, you have to not kill the host. And so if COVID came out, we've been watching Yellowstone, so I apologize for the the Bronco analogies here. But if you come out of the chute, like a bucking Bronco, over time, you're gonna probably kill all the riders and whatnot. Maybe that's a special show for that. But as the horses, if they want to get a lot of riders and whatnot, it's not going to be something that knocks off every rider. So the ponies, the ones who go calmly around the loop, are the ones that are going to attract more riders. And in this case, maybe it's not a great example, but in this case, that's what happens with cold viruses. They tend not to knock you down too hard so that you will be standing up and being able to pass this virus to the next person, et cetera, et cetera. So through the various phases from the ancestral version of 2019, it's literally called that, to the more recent Greek letters, alpha, beta. They seem to skip mostly gamma wasn't a big deal, delta, and then skip a few more letters up to Omicron. What you're finding is that there's been some attenuation. It's a milder version. Not only that, it's a very different version. So, I mentioned this in last week's broadcast, but I think it's worth covering once again, which is that the FDA, in its honesty, rare honesty, has pulled various of the monoclonal antibody preparations that are out for treating versions of the coronavirus. And those monoclonal antibodies are specifically for that strain. So there's a Delta monoclonal antibody. And now it's been pulled from the market because Delta is no longer hanging around. 99 point something percent of corona cases are Omicron. Now there's like a slightly new, like a sub, Omicron B. But either way, it's no longer Delta around. And which has Omicron. So they pulled the monoclonal antibody that's against Delta. So the example I use, if you had a policeman in front of your house with a restraining order for Alec Baldwin, and he can see Alec Baldwin's face, he won't let Alec Baldwin in. But as you get further differences from him, Stephen, Daniel, James, whatever, he's not going to be able to differentiate well enough to say that's still a Baldwin. He's going to let some of them in, Alec Baldwin's niece, and so forth. And so what happens here is that so for the monoclonal antibody treatment, honestly, I think this is a reasonable proposition. If you want to treat Omicron with if you have it's not that severe in illness, but if you did have it severe enough that you needed to go to monoclonal antibodies to treat it, you would get one that's specific for this Omicron. So Omicron does not, on its external aspect, in a protein antibody sense, look enough like Delta that you can use the Delta one. That's us from a few months ago, from 5, 6 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, 7 or 8 months ago. But so you are using a completely different monoclonal preparation. Now, these monoclonals are essentially, I mean, those are from the laboratory, and I assume they make them from plasmids or whatever, and bacteria and whatnot. But the ones that we make ourselves, we make through our own immune system, through natural immunity, and we make them from vaccine preparation. So the mRNA vaccine um, to COVID-19 produces the spike protein from the ancestral version only. So you're basically giving photographs of Alec Baldwin when he's left the scene long, long ago. He's not coming back. And so when you have the new ones, to keep boosting the production of our monoclonal antibody, we're going to produce a single clone, a single strain of of um, of protein. We're producing it to a strain that no longer is in existence. This is showing up in the data, and the absurdity of the proposition that you keep giving directions to observe the ancestral strain when it's not been on the scene at all lately is frankly, it's ludicrous, and it's sort of crazy. And if I proposed it, and nobody else had heard of this, I'd be laughed out. The fact of the matter is that the public health establishment does it, and they're very much wedded to everyone getting the vaccine, and they're kind of petulant and storming around and stomping their feet, their feet, and really pissed off that you didn't all do it fast enough, and you haven't doing it every single time they say, and you haven't gotten your second or third or fourth in the case, shots of this variant, which I think Israel is up to now. Frustrates them, and but they don't have a good rationale, because if you can pull the monoclonals, this is my logical point. I keep saying nobody's refuted this one yet, so if you can refute it, please do so. But if you think, if the monoclonals can be pulled from the shelves and are made over and over again based on the specific strain that's out there, why are you giving essentially the same monoclonal antibody for the ancestral version through the vaccine? So to state more clearly, we produce our own monoclonal antibodies just like you can get from those injections, but we do it by proxy through the vaccine. So if they had a brand new vaccine for Omicron, it would produce Omicron spike protein, and that would cure and prevent people from having Omicron now. But what we're giving is something that produces a monoclonal antibody against the spike protein of the ancestral version from 3 years ago. That's not around anymore, so you're fighting the last battle. And I apologize for bringing this up again, but this is a very, very crucial point. And this shows the big mystery. Everyone's like, oh my God, how can it be that the people who are vaccinated are showing up in the hospital more with Omicron than people who are not vaccinated, or people who haven't been vaccinated as much or not boosted are showing up fewer times in the hospital, less frequency. The data from Germany, from I think it's the Robert Koch Institute or something, which is kind of their CDC, showed that, again, I don't have the slide in front of me right now, but the something like 90% of the population in hospital have been vaccinated, and only 70% of the population has been vaccinated, the underlying population. So the 30% of people who are unvaccinated are showing up at the hospital only 10% of the time. So therefore, they're 3 times less likely to show up with Omicron hospitalized. I think that probably has to do with their age and so forth. But at the very least, the vaccine's not showing the booster part of the vaccine is not showing any benefit against the current strain. Why is that? Because it has nothing to do with the current strain. It's if anything, it's a monoclonal antibody treatment for a strain that no longer exists. So go for it. And why would you do this over and over? And aside from the mere exercise of conformity and following other people's rules, this is kind of the problem that we're having right now. We're in our America's hat, Canada, is hopefully going to be rescued by the voice of the people via the truckers. I think it's a shame that this has to happen this way. I'm not interested in I'm not really interested in mob democracy and so forth. But when you stifle people's voices over and over again, you give them very little recourse. And I think the truckers have essentially the right idea, which is this is we've done this for too long. You got to stop this. You got to take your kind of foot off our neck. Let us do our lives. We are adults. We'll figure things out. And the fact of the matter is that across the board, it's hard for me to. I was googling this today earlier, seroprevalence rates in the U.S. From vaccine and/or natural immunity. Um, I imagine that by now, uh, a near unanimity of the population has had vaccine, the one version or another of the COVID, or both. And there are probably very few completely coronavirus naive individuals around right now. I think I'm not sure what the total background rate of the United States is. It's probably 80% or higher of individuals have had a vaccine. And, probably that number, 75, 80% has had COVID of one type or another. Omicron's passing through like crazy. So between the two of those, I mean, that probably, leaves, 15% of 15%. Maybe this, we're probably getting into the high 90 percentages of people who um, um, have had vaccine, the COVID, or both. And when I say COVID, one of the variants, whether COVID-19, COVID-20, COVID-21. So it'll be like any of the Greek letters or the ancestral version. So, the completely vaccine naive population, I mean, they're probably youngsters and they don't really care one way or another. And in either event, they're on their own. I mean, it's like I don't think this is at this point, the Omicron is probably 10 times less dangerous than Delta, and Delta was less dangerous than the ancestral version. So you're probably talking about something that's 20 times lighter a footprint than the original version. So, if you were kind of, beamed down from another planet, or we had those Men in Black amnesia, flash guns and so forth, and we just woke up today, we hadn't heard of COVID and so forth. We're just living our regular lives, our regular house, our regular jobs and so forth. We would see people getting, some symptoms, cold, sniffles, and so forth. We would call this winter. I'm in the Northeast, so we have snow out in the ground. It was 6 degrees the other day, Fahrenheit, freezing. So, people get sniffles, they get colds, they get this and that, they get achy. This is nothing out of the ordinary, nothing for which, our lives should be upended, nor our personal choices dictated. If this were, and I've said this many times, if this were, aerosolized HIV, yeah, I mean, I think you should do some really, uh, tough things. Make sure people don't all drop dead for them until you come up with a cure. But here we've had various levels of cures, and those that get ignored, it's got to be always the vaccine, the vaccine, the sec. And again, if they had made a new formulation, they made one warp speed. And frankly, I've been covering the Zika vaccine, which, because I've written a book on Zika and what happened to it, why it mysteriously disappeared. But if they had, the Zika vaccine's been 7 years, they still don't have one. So I give Mr. Trump credit for actually doing Operation Warp Speed at warp speed. And kind of the difference is it's a side, kind of a side bar. But for the Zika phenomenon, there have 45 different trial sites, 17 different, teams. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of different places where the money was flowed all over around the world to come up with the Zika vaccine. Nobody did. Um, in this case, there was there was no involvement of private industry. And so I give the Trump White House huge credit for coming up with warp speed and getting business and the research community to coincide. And I think it was a real, if it could have come out even sooner, when the ancestral version was, not quite in certain areas and countries, it would have been even more effective. There's like almost never been a case of applying a vaccine after an illness and continually applying one that's out of date. So we don't do this with the flu shot. We give the flu shot appropriate for its upcoming seasons, not afterwards, and we update it every year. So if you wanted to, really be a vaccine enthusiast for COVID, you should enforce that we get new ones all the time. But again, because see above, the viruses tend to self-attenuate to milder strains if there's no animal reservoir. It's going to be a moot point anyway, because after Omicron, whatever Greek letter they decide to pick or not, it's going to be probably still as mild or milder. The symptoms of Omicron are not that distinguishable from bad cold, maybe a mild flu. And again, most people have been vaccinated for the tougher versions. There's no vaccination for Omicron, blah, 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 blah. So I don't know if that makes any sense. Maybe if you, didn't have full understanding of this, you can go back and look at it a little bit. You can just press rewind. I'm going to try to spend not forever tonight because I got a couple things else going on. But maybe I'll just churn up the internet machine here and cover a few things that I found interesting today. Um, so this is from the National Post in Canada. Elon Musk says fringe minority is actually the government. I mean, the truckers have been called a fringe minority. Um, Protesting in a Canadian winter shows real commitment. And, uh, there's kind of I don't know if we can see this video here, but this is Ottawa, downtown Ottawa. Um, this is the protest. This is, he says it looks like the fringe minority is not quite so fringe. I've never been to Ottawa, quite beautiful. It has that London kind of feel to it. Um, I left out the music. Um, and he has taken a break from politics. There's a nice photo of trucks. This has been a massive protest. And again, remains to be seen what will be done from it. I hope something positive, because I think one of the real bugs of COVID that was uncovered is that the parliamentary system has its weaknesses. Um, Canada has a parliamentary system. We have a constitutional republic that's differing, because even though Canada has provinces, the federal government, when one party comes in charge, it's sort of a dictatorship of the majority. So whoever's in charge can do pretty much whatever that government group wants to do. We have a lot more checks and balances between our levels of federal power, and we also have more rights reserved to the individual states than I believe Canada does. Ditto Australia and New Zealand falling into this parliamentary trap. So I think parliamentary government is better than what the CCP and the Soviet, the Russia have going. So forth. I think they have more freedoms, but they also have fewer freedoms than we have here. And we've benefited from the ability to do side by side experiments. When you are maintaining a firm draconian hand, and you want to promulgate your ideas that lockdowns are essential, it doesn't really work when someplace next door is not doing that and doing just as well as you. So I'm going to try to get to some aspects of that here. So let's see, where was it? I need my glasses. So here, um, this just came out a couple days ago. Johns Hopkins researchers. So I'm going to put this up here. Johns Hopkins researchers: lockdowns had little impact on COVID deaths. And I'm going to let you read the fine print yourself. I can put the link up, but they found, I've never seen that T-shirt. My parents went to Las Vegas, and all I got was this lousy T-shirt. So you see here, dozens of scientific studies. The lockdowns during the early phase of the pandemic in 2020 reduced COVID-19 mortality by about 0.2%. So all those lockdowns, and all I got was this lousy, no change in mortality, pretty much. So you pretty much ruin society. And what do we get? I mean, again, if this were, Ebola, HIV on wings or something like that, different story. You do what you have to do, but this was never that. And as a respiratory virus, it was going to pass and do what it had to do. So this has been a total own goal, as they say in soccer. It's a complete sadness. Um, let's see what else we have here today for you. Um, um, Here's something speaking to the point I was making earlier about the vaccines. This is from Alex Berenson, who's on Substack now. He got kicked off Twitter. Robert W. Malone got kicked off Twitter. He was on the Joe Rogan show. I recommend you listen to it. You have to be on Spotify, but it's a very good listen. It's I think you should go probably to hour one, around the 1 hour 10-minute mark. He actually brings up the very similar point to what I talk about with the monoclonal antibodies, and so I'm going to attribute it to great minds think alike. I think you should listen to him because he's very knowledgeable and he's brave, and so that's a nice thing. And his opinions, frankly, have morphed over time a little bit. so this Alex Berenson, Israel is overrun with COVID. The vaccines have failed. The experiment must stop. And so I can't read. I can read Hebrew a little bit, but I'm not going to be able to translate this right off the bat for you. But basically, I think they're on their fourth shot, so the third booster, calling it, and they keep doing so. Definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Right now, um, they can't get any more immune to COVID-19 than they already have. But again, this is not COVID-19. This is COVID-21, and so they're saying here the tragedy of the mRNA vaccine is that they don't work at all. Um, they do work, and he's showing they work temporarily now, but frankly, they would have worked much better prior to 2020. That's when they really would have worked. If we had had them before um, the big outburst in spring of 2020, but we didn't. Giving them after the fact, once the virus has disappeared, is sort of pointless because we're always expecting new variants. So right now they're just making a huge mistake. So I'm going to leave that there for you. I'm happy to send the link. And what else do we have here? I'm just going to go through some slides and we'll see where this conversation goes. Oops. I'll put it in slideshow mode, makes it look nicer. um, so here's kind of an interesting critique, I assume from her hat and the sign in the back. This is in Canada. Did the, basically, are the, are the our government's failing with or without or because of COVID. I mean, this is kind of the standard, from or with COVID. There's a case, I'm not going to be able to pull it up right off the bat, but I think it was Ned Lamont in Connecticut, the governor, early on April 2020. He was pointing out a child had died from coronavirus. And there's been some investigation because pretty much across the board, there have been no children dying from COVID. And this was, I think, an infant, a 1-year-old. And it made news at the time, was covered and whatnot. And somebody went back and looked at it. And it turns out that 1-year-old, unfortunately, sadly, was smothered by his drug addicted, doped out mother who rolled over on him. And so when the baby got there, I don't know what the issue, I can't really even comprehend this, but they did some testing either at the hospital or post-mortem, and they found COVID, and they called it a COVID death, and they ran with this as a matter of fear. And so this is a total tragedy. It's a misuse and so forth. And so, your government, needs to make that distinction, whether it's with or from COVID. So this baby died from being smothered by a sadly addicted mom, and COVID had nothing to do with the case at all. These are our elites, and in a sense how they look and feel about you. On the right is Gavin Newsom, and he made the same excuse that Dr. Fauci did at the Washington Nationals games in 2020. These only took it off to drink for a drink of water. This is not the case. You can see other people in the booth. Not when there's no masks to be seen. They don't have them in their hands. And he said that Magic Johnson really wanted to take a picture with him. I'm sure assume it was the other way around. But if he cared this much, I mean, Magic Johnson is a 65-year-old man with HIV. So that's, immunocompromised. Now, it would never occur to Governor Handsome over there, or Newsom, that Mr. Johnson's, kind of last 15, 20 years, maybe it's been 30 years since he announced he had AIDS, HIV, is that he has lived this long through therapeutics. He has lived this long and seems perfectly in fit health, I guess, and robust and so forth, despite having HIV, which is uniformly deadly without treatment. So this was not done with a vaccine. There's been no HIV vaccine. If he had waited for a vaccine, he'd be dead. They took therapeutics. So this is, I'm sure he's not thinking about this while he's watching the Rams move on to the Super Bowl, but it's an absurdity. This is the kind of the way that your elites think about you. And this is what pisses off or angers the truckers of the world because they see the dichotomy and the double standard. This is a picture I took off the TV watching the same game. I hadn't seen the Gavin Newsom shot. I'm not sure who the actor on the left is. Maybe somebody can help me out here. He looks sort of familiar, but there's Leo, the environmentalist. So with he has his chin brassiere on. I don't know why you bother. Clearly he's got a bunch of sterilizing alcohol preparations here. Probably, they're using these expensive vodkas as hand wash, sanitation, so forth. But just kind of this, I just don't know why you bother. I mean, it's like, why do this? I have no idea. But they are actors, so they are acting according to whatever they think they need to present at any given moment. I just kind of like this cartoon. The quote as well is separate, but when a clown moves into a palace, he doesn't become a king. The palace becomes a circus. That's a Turkish proverb. And so, currently, Mr. Trudeau currently, has a conveniently a case of COVID 21, which I'm sure he calls COVID-19, and he's disappeared from Ottawa for that reason. But I think it really has much more to do with cowardice. Um, uh, so a friend of mine put the quote up on the top. Wow, I wonder what changed the mind of these satanic tyrants. Like all of a sudden, Quebec scraps its plans, to uh, keep lockdowns and so forth. So they somehow they got religion, which was secondarily applied. And Kurt Schlichter thinks it's hilarious that the socialists are furious about the workers of the world, finally uniting. And they just had no idea that they're going to be uniting against them. This is interesting. I think it's kind of funny. So what do we got here? This refers to the Joe Rogan Malone episode, for which Neil Young or Neil Old or whatever he wants to call himself, kind of, he had no actual right because he'd already sold his oeuvre of songs to somebody else to pull them off Spotify because he had no actual rights to them anymore. But here, health experts warn of thousands of Joe Rogan-style uncensored conversations increasingly happening between everyday people. So I hope you actually will do that with us here. And I'm trying to be not quite a beacon, but a little bit of a mini light on some of this stuff. This is kind of a spooky thing I saw the other day. It's a new press release from our CDC. I highlighted the P's because I don't know if they did this on purpose, but they alliteratively, the NIAID pandemic preparedness plan targets prototype and priority pathogens and a preemptive approach to They've got this little nifty logo. I'm sure somebody spent a few thousand, tens of thousands of your tax dollars working on. The inner, well, I suppose this second inner ring of responses would be vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics. So it really depends on the virus. HIV, there'd be no vaccines. Diagnostics, I guess, but therapeutics would be like almost all of this. With COVID, it's all vaccines all the time. I mean, obviously some testing and so forth, but therapeutics have been really downplayed, and I think that's a shame. So a friend of mine carried on the alliteration. You read on the top. Let's see. Piss poor pandemic preparedness plans, prototyping priority pathogens, plunder proletariat's progress by pandering to plutocrats' profiteering. So that's sort of brilliant, I think. Let's see. So let's go ahead and make sure I was still streaming us here. So let's just move on a little bit. This is, you can maybe take some offense of this. I mean, I'm Jewish, and I don't think it's quite the same. The Jews were rounded up exclusively and they were brought to their death. But I do think the aspect of excluding people and shaming them and pointing at them as somehow different and subhuman, there have been talks of people being denied, not just talk, there have been actual cases of people being denied hospitalization. There's somebody first online for, I think, a heart transplant in Boston right now, and he's in his 30s, and he doesn't want to be vaccinated. And he's not going to get the heart until he accedes to this. I don't want to get into the medical aspects of that because I think it's complicated. There's certain aspects of being immunocompromised after the heart transplant and whatnot. But we're seeing aspects of this where people are being dehumanized, and I think this is what brings on the big protests. It's hard for people to fathom this and understand it. This is I came across today earlier from Michael Crichton, the late Michael Crichton, Crichton, a lecture. It's been 20 years ago, um, but Chernobyl. Mind you, the TV series is really fascinating. You should watch it. But the predictions of deaths from the public health establishment and from institutions, so forth, were thousands of times higher than actuality. And so these are all the various predictions, and in yellow I highlighted the actual numbers. So the United Nations Commission 2005 found a total of 56 um, uh, deaths from Chernobyl itself. And the New York Post at the time, had predicted nearly 16,000. CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Company, same thing. New York Times, a little bit lower. But all these numbers, all these predictions throughout the years subsequent, this 1986, took 20 years for the actual number to come out. Why did it take this long to come out? I don't know, but it's massively smaller than the actual. And it turns out in the UN Commission report, which I could have brought up, the major issues with Chernobyl are kind of the mental issues that people have from feeling as if something horrible is going to happen to them. They become immobilized, and they become dependent, and they become dependent on the state information, oddly enough, even though it's so fatuously, fabulously, fictitiously wrong. The orders of magnitude different from what are predicted. So this is not Chernobyl, but it does seem that fear is something that bureaucrats are good at, and it is a power accumulator, and we have to be very wary of this. Now, this is an old one. This is from 100 years ago. Not quite relevant, but I just thought I'd bring it up. This is regarding the Spanish flu, and it took some time to get things back to normal. But you have to admit, they didn't have real virology back then. They didn't have kind of testing we have, precise, immediate testing. They didn't have the hospital facilities. It took them a couple of years. It shouldn't have taken us this long. We have 100 years of better science and knowledge, and we have the internet, we have instant communication, and still we're barely able to kind of get up from our feet more than or quicker than they did. And they had an entire Great War, later called World War One, to deal with, and a case fatality rate that dealt with much younger people. And the QALY, the quality adjusted life years lost, probably an order of magnitude higher than what we experienced, and maybe more, given that the population mostly susceptible and dying was young, rather than our median age of 82 here. This is from my Zika talk and book, that the kind of the timeline for the Zika vaccine. I'm not going to. You can read this and so forth, but the part that interests me is on the bottom, that Science magazine has learned that the NIAID, that's Dr. Fauci's group, plans to test a vaccine by deliberately infecting people with Zika. So whose health are we really, when public health is doing public health, are they really doing it for you or for themselves? I mean, I think it's a fascination to have made a Zika vaccine. They never did, mind you, but they want to give people Zika so they can protect people from Zika by making a vaccine for which they've just infected you. I don't know, you tell me. So you can read this one here. Natural immunity during the Delta wave. So natural immunity is stronger than vaccines alone during the Delta wave, and it's likely, I believe it's the same thing happening now, as I mentioned from the data in Germany, that people who are having natural immunity, unvaccinated, do better than people who have been vaccinated without natural immunity. If you've had the natural immunity, with or without the vaccine, you're doing about the same. So those are the two green numbers here. So the real determinant of how well you do is having had natural immunity, especially now that the COVID-19 vaccine is dealing with something that no longer exists, is giving you antibodies to something that's no longer in circulation. This is a simpler slide of the same basic proposition. You can stop and read this from the CDC. You might have heard of them. And so the you know, the let me get my glasses here. You get basically this is the number of times relative protected against infection versus unvaccinated people with no prior cases. Whoops, sorry, going the wrong way. So unvaccinated or vaccinated with a previous infection, you're doing, let's see how to read this, chance of contracting COVID on May 30th, chance of contracting COVID on October 30th. So you went down with your chances went down with having had previous infection either way. So those who do the worst are those with no previous infection. This is a slide from the same article. And I just want to point out that those who are completely naive with no vaccine and no exposure actually had higher rates of hospitalization during Delta last summer. I don't think that's the case with Omicron currently, because Omicron doesn't really hospitalize people that much. So what they're doing is differentiating these numbers here at the bottom, and it doesn't seem to appear that those who are vaccinated do any better than those who have had regular natural immunity. So I think we covered this a little bit. Johns Hopkins showing that there's really been no evidence of any benefit from lockdowns. I'm just going to go to the, let's see if we have any questions first of all. I'm going to go to the kind of memes section of our talk tonight. You can spend a minute on this. Is like how the narrative keeps changing. 2 weeks to flatten the curve. I mean, 2 years. I mean, until we've hit 80% vax, et cetera, et cetera. Keep repeating steps 1 through 6 for new variants. I mean, eliminating the common cold. I meant dictatorship. So the narrative keeps changing. We're not really having our public health publicly protected in this manner anymore, when we're just being locked down to avoid getting the common cold or flu. You can stop and look at some of this. This is some of the changes in the expressions and thoughts of our great leaders as time goes on. They're speaking out of both sides of their mouths. I just like this slide. I came across this, I forget where. I wish I had done it myself. That's why I put it up. But is that the end of my show? Okay, that's the end of the slides. So let's see if I can just pull this off, and if I have any closing words here. Not really. I think I'm going to just call it a night. If you would like me to explain any other aspects of COVID-19, COVID-20, COVID-21, or now COVID-22, let me know. And I'm happy to have been with you. Please share this as well as you can. I thank you so much for having let me into your home.